The day Derek and Maria Broaddus closed on their dream home, 657 Boulevard, they felt like their lives had reached a new chapter. Nestled in a quiet, tree-lined suburban neighborhood, the house was everything they had ever wanted. It had a spacious yard for their 3 kids to play in, a cozy porch perfect for summer evenings, and plenty of room to grow. But their excitement turned to unease within days of moving in. It started innocently enough, a simple white envelope addressed in looping, childlike handwriting to the new owners. Maria assumed it was a friendly welcome from a neighbor. But when she opened it, her stomach sank. The letter began cordially, "Dearest new neighbors at 657 Boulevard, allow me to welcome you to the neighborhood." But as Maria read further, the tone shifted. "How did you end up here? Did 657 Boulevard call to you with its force within?" 657 Boulevard has been the subject of my family for decades now, and as it approaches its 110th birthday, I have been put in charge of watching and waiting for its second coming. The writer, who signed the letter as the Watcher, claimed a generational obsession with the house. The letter went on to describe personal details about Derek, Maria, and their children, details they hadn't shared with anyone. It mentioned their children's nicknames and ages, and even commented on how beautiful they looked when playing in the yard. "I see you've already had contractors in. Have they found what's hidden in the walls yet? In time, they will." Terrified, Derek and Maria immediately contacted the police, but there wasn't much they could do. The letter didn't include any specific threats. There were no fingerprints on the envelope. The couple tried to brush it off as a prank. But within a week, a second letter arrived. "You have moved into a house I have been watching for decades. 657 Boulevard is mine. My grandfather watched the house in the 1920s, and my father in the 1960s. It is now my time. Do you know the history of the house? Do you know what lies within the walls?" This time, the letter listed the exact positions of the family members at various times of the day. It described where Maria liked to sit in the mornings to drink coffee and noted the exact moment their children left for school. The police began investigating the neighbors, but none seemed suspicious. Derek installed security cameras, motion sensors, and floodlights, but it did little to calm their nerves. The letters kept coming, each one more chilling than the last. "I see you've decided to bring a swing set into the yard. Your children will love it, but be careful. Are they too loud? I can hear them from inside my home. I am pleased to know their names. I am pleased to know who they are now." As weeks turned into months, Maria began to unravel. She couldn't sleep, convinced someone was watching them every second of the day. One night, she woke to the sound of footsteps outside their bedroom window. Derek ran outside, but there was no one there. The next morning, they found another letter. "Have you figured out where I am yet, who I am? There are hundreds and hundreds of cars that drive by 657 Boulevard each day. Perhaps I am in one. Look out the windows at all the people who stroll by each day. Perhaps I am one." The Broadduses hired a private investigator, but even with all the surveillance, they couldn't uncover the Watcher's identity. The neighbors grew suspicious of one another, but no one was caught leaving letters. The final straw came when the Watcher began hinting at harming the children. Will the young blood play in the basement? Or are they too afraid to go down there alone? I would be very afraid if I were them. It is far away from the rest of the house. If you were upstairs, you would never hear them scream. That was it. Derek and Maria packed up and left. They couldn't sell the house. The letters scared off potential buyers, and they couldn't live there knowing the Watcher was always lurking. To this day, the Watcher's identity remains a mystery. Katie had always been proud of her little house on Maple Street. It wasn't much, a modest bungalow with a small garden out front, but it was hers. She'd worked hard to buy it and cherished the independence it gave her. Living alone wasn't always easy, but she loved her quiet evenings spent reading by the fireplace or tending to her garden on weekends. Her neighbors were mostly elderly, the kind who nodded politely but rarely stopped to chat. Except for Mr. Grayson. He lived 2 houses down and always made a point to say hello whenever he saw her. He was a thin, wiry man in his 70s, with pale blue eyes that seemed to linger just a little too long. Katie always felt a bit uneasy around him, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. One morning, as she stepped onto her porch to grab the newspaper, she noticed a small package sitting on the welcome mat. It was wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. Curious, she picked it up and found a note attached. "For you, Mr. Grayson." Inside were a batch of cookies chocolate chip, still warm. Katie was surprised but thought it was a kind gesture. Maybe he was just a lonely old man trying to be friendly. She decided to thank him the next time she saw him but didn't eat the cookies. Something about the unexpected gift felt off. The next morning, there was another package. This time, it was a small wooden figurine bird, hand-carved with delicate precision. The note read, "I noticed you watching the sparrows in your garden. Thought you might like this, Mr. Grayson." Katie felt a chill. She had been watching the sparrows the previous afternoon, but how could he have known? She hadn't seen him outside. Shrugging it off as a coincidence, she placed the bird on a shelf and tried to forget about it. But the gifts kept coming. Every few days, a new package would appear on her porch. A potted plant, a knitted scarf, a set of antique teacups. Each one came with a note, and each note revealed unsettling details about her life. "You look so peaceful when you're reading by the fire. That blue dress you wore yesterday suits you perfectly. I noticed you didn't lock your back door last night. Be careful." Katie's unease turned to fear. She started double-checking her locks, closing her curtains, and avoiding her porch altogether. When she saw Mr. Grayson outside, she would quickly duck back into the house. But he always seemed to be watching, his pale blue eyes following her every move. One night, Katie woke to a soft tapping sound. It was coming from her bedroom window. Her heart raced as she grabbed her phone and crept toward the window, trying to stay out of sight. When she peeked through the curtain, there was no one there. But the next morning, another gift was waiting on her porch, a figurine of a woman standing by a window, with tiny curtains drawn to match her own. That was when Katie decided to confront him. She marched over to his house, clutching the figurine in her hand, and knocked on the door. Mr. Grayson opened it with a smile. "Hello, Katie," he said, his voice warm and calm. "Stop leaving me gifts," she demanded, holding up the figurine. "This has to stop. It's not funny. It's creepy." His smile faded, and for a moment, he looked genuinely confused. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I don't know what you mean." Katie stared at him, her anger giving way to doubt. Could he really not know? She turned and walked away, unsure of what to believe. That night, she stayed awake, listening for any sound outside. Around 2 a.m., she heard a soft shuffling on her porch. She peeked through the curtains and saw a shadowy figure bending down to place something on the mat. It wasn't Mr. Grayson. Terrified, Katie called the police. They arrived quickly but found no one outside. On the porch was another figurine, this one of a man and a woman standing together, hand in hand. The man had pale blue eyes. When the police questioned Mr. Grayson the next day, he insisted he hadn't left her any gifts. In fact, he claimed he had been receiving strange packages himself, anonymous letters and items he didn't recognize. They searched his house and found nothing suspicious, but Katie couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't telling the whole truth. A few days later, Mr. Grayson's house was empty. He had disappeared without a word, leaving behind only a cryptic note on his kitchen table. "I tried to protect her, but now they'll come for me." Katie moved out of the neighborhood soon after. To this day, she wonders who was really watching her and why. Leela and Sam were thrilled when they found a charming duplex to rent in a quiet neighborhood. It was their first home together, and while it wasn't perfect, it had character: a cozy living room, vintage wood paneling, and a spacious shared basement for storage. The basement, however, had a strange energy about it. The single door leading into it was heavy, with a lock that seemed unnecessarily secure. The landlord, a no-nonsense woman named Mrs. Berman, brushed off their questions when they asked about it. "It's just an old house," she said. "Things settle. You might hear some noises now and then, but it's nothing to worry about." The neighbor who lived on the other side of the duplex was an older woman named Clara. She kept to herself, rarely making noise or coming outside. Leela and Sam barely saw her except for the occasional wave from her side of the porch. One night, as the couple lay in bed, Leela woke to a faint creaking sound. She nudged Sam awake. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Sam groaned but listened. From beneath them, there was the distinct sound of a door creaking open, followed by the faintest shuffle of footsteps. "It's probably Clara," he said grudgingly. "Maybe she's storing something in the basement." The sound continued for a few minutes before stopping abruptly. The next morning, she asked Clara about it. "I don't use the basement much," Clara replied, her voice hesitant. "It's too cold and damp. I haven't been down there in months." That night, Leela and Sam decided to check out the basement for themselves. Armed with a flashlight, they unlocked the heavy door and descended the creaky wooden stairs. The air was musty, and the single bulb hanging from the ceiling cast eerie shadows. The basement was divided into two sections, one for each side of the duplex. Their section was filled with boxes, old furniture, and odds and ends left by previous tenants. But it was the other side that caught their attention. Clara's section was completely empty: no boxes, no furniture, nothing. And then they noticed something strange. The wall that separated the two halves had a small, rectangular cutout near the floor. It looked like someone had hastily patched it with plywood, but the edges were uneven, as if it had been done in a hurry. "What is that?" Leela whispered. Sam shook his head. "No idea. Let's just go back upstairs." But as they turned to leave, they heard a soft, almost imperceptible tapping sound coming from the other side of the plywood. Leela froze, clutching Sam's arm. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Before Sam could respond, the tapping stopped, replaced by the faint sound of a door creaking open somewhere in the distance. They bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind them and locking it tightly. The next day, Leela called Mrs. Berman to ask about the basement. The landlord's response was dismissive. "It's an old house," she said again. "You're probably hearing the pipes or the wind." But the noises continued. Every few nights, they would hear faint footsteps or the creak of the basement door. One evening, Sam decided to install a small camera at the top of the basement stairs. The next morning, they reviewed the footage. For hours, the video showed nothing but an empty staircase. But around 3 a.m., the basement door creaked open slowly. No one stepped through. The door remained ajar for several minutes before closing on its own. That was when they noticed something else. In the corner of the screen, a shadow flitted across the frame just for a second, too fast to make out any details. Leela and Sam were terrified. They tried asking Clara about the basement again, but this time, she grew visibly uncomfortable. "I really don't know much about it," she said, her hands trembling. "I've always just ignored it. I think that's for the best." A week later, Clara moved out without warning. She left no forwarding address, and Mrs. Berman claimed to know nothing about her sudden departure. After Clara left, the noises grew louder and more frequent. One night, the couple awoke to the sound of loud banging coming from the basement. It was as if someone or something was trying to break through the door. Sam grabbed a baseball bat and cautiously opened the basement door. The stairs were empty, but the banging continued. It wasn't coming from the door, it was coming from below. Summoning his courage, Sam descended the stairs. As he reached the bottom, he noticed something new. The plywood patch in the wall had been pried loose, revealing a dark hole. Beyond it was a narrow tunnel leading into the darkness. "Leela," he called out, his voice shaking. "You need to see this." Together, they peered into the tunnel. It appeared to stretch for several feet before disappearing into blackness. The walls were made of rough stone, and the air was damp and cold. They called the police, who arrived and searched the tunnel. It led to another house a block away, a long abandoned property with boarded-up windows. Inside, they found remnants of food wrappers, old blankets, and what looked like a makeshift bed. Whoever had been living there was long gone. Mrs. Berman later admitted that the tunnel had been there for decades. No one knew who had built it or why, but she claimed it was harmless. Leela and Sam didn't believe her. They moved out the following week, leaving the house and its mysterious basement behind. But sometimes, late at night, Leela wonders who or what had been watching them from the shadows of the tunnel.